today. And as you can see, Louisa is all the way from Prague joining us today. She's one of our international members, and she's been doing some fascinating research for her honours thesis, which she got a first-class honours for. And now she can rush off and do a PhD next. You might need some time to recover, Louisa. One honours thesis is enough for now. But we thought it would be wonderful to take this opportunity through the online events of sharing some of the wonderful work that our international members are doing. And next month, you'll be hearing from Dr. Ms. Michael Redmond, a very fiery redhead from Rochester in New York, will be sharing some of her insights as well. But today, we have Louisa sharing what she's learnt through her work as an expat Australian in the Czech Republic and Europe more broadly, in the enterprise risk management, security risk management space, specifically on Convergence. And we'll all look forward to hearing her insights from the research that she's been doing. Next slide, Louisa. Now, it's important to be mindful of the code of conduct that applies for our face-to-face meetings as well as our online meetings. We have had some difficulties in the past, and it's really important that we meet the expectations of AWSN's board, that we take this as an opportunity to learn and share, network, and become more knowledgeable, and we hope to be so after Louisa's presentation today. We're dedicated to creating a safe environment and have zero tolerance of unacceptable behaviour, and any matters can be reported to the board. You have their email address there. Next slide. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Zoom, although people now say we've all been zoomed out, but in case you are, there's a chat feature in the bottom of your screen. Please use that to ask any questions, and we'll work through those questions after Louisa's presentation of about 30 minutes. Next slide, please. We have upcoming webinars. As you see, I mentioned Dr. Michael Redmond's sharing her insights, another international member on the 17th of September at 11 AM, an unusual time, I know it. And one of our chapter leads from Melbourne, Daisy, is working on the Cyber CX webinar that will be scheduled the following week. Next slide, please. Now, for those of you less familiar with our online presence, here's some ways you can connect with us through the Australian Women in Security Network, 2 LinkedIn groups. We have a company page as well as a private members group where lots of our activities are shared, including webinars in these series. We also have a Twitter account, which is quite active, and we share the webinar recordings, and you can find them either on our website or on our YouTube channel, which you're welcome to subscribe to. Next slide. We have a number of sponsors for whom we're incredibly grateful, and there's some of their logos. You'd be familiar, I mentioned earlier, with Cyber CX as AWSN's platinum sponsor. We also have the Australian Signals Directorate, the Australian Cyber Security Centre, AGL, and a couple of others there whose logos are a little on the small side, but I'm sure it's all on our website. Thanks very much. Next slide. Now, we're in the process of transitioning our member database into an online system which will be more readily available to chapter leads like me. And to do that, you need to go through our website onto a Google Docs form to confirm your membership if you haven't already done so. We are appreciative that in some corporate and government IT systems, that's not an option. You may have to use a private device and private email to access that system. But please confirm your membership. Thanks very much, Louisa. Next slide. And I think this is you. Enjoy.
Yep, looks like me.
Thank you.
So we'll just have a quick look at the structure of what I'm going to talk about today. I'll give you a bit more of an idea of who I am, and then we're going to talk about what Convergence is and define it and what this means practically. And then we're going to look a little bit at the research I just finished this year looking at the threat landscape today, why there's such low implementation rates for this thing called convergence, the barriers that are making this happen, and hopefully we can find some conclusions. So just a little bit more about me. I'm co-director for a company called TeamMacro, and I've worked for the last 10 years as enterprise risk and security management software consultant, and I'm based in Prague in Czech Republic. My company's implemented a variety of solutions, but our flagship product is an incident management system that's based on this centralized management structure. And we've been lucky to implement this with industries including logistics, retail and wholesale, energies and utilities, and construction. In the last few years, this has mostly been in Europe, but we've also deployed globally. So in this role, I was able to see firsthand difficulties that security managers seem to be facing in their respective industries. And I became interested in this thing called convergence and why it seems to be having a hard time becoming widespread, because to me it seems like a fairly logical approach. So let's define convergence first. Convergence might mean slightly different things to different people. And this is partly because as yet, there's no standard method to implement it. And people are practicing it in different ways. And it seems like sometimes people are practicing it without even realizing that's what they're doing or that it has a name. So for the purpose of this talk, we'll use the definition put forward by ASIS, which I'm sure is an organization most of us are familiar with. But just in case we're not, it's the largest organization of security professionals, and it actively contributes to professional standards, certification, and research. So I think it's appropriate to use this definition in this context. And their definition of convergence is the identification of security risks and interdependencies between business functions and solutions to address those risks and interdependencies. So a converged approach to security, it means understanding that our assets are no longer purely physical. I mean, our assets are now also digital, they're information-based, but they're also intangible things like reputation. And recognizing that resilience and continuity is critical to maintaining these assets. It's a holistic approach that reaches across an organization outside of the remit of traditional security. So you can really get a single view of risk, because if you don't have a single view of risk, things start to fall through the gaps. So what convergence isn't, is it's not a standardized process. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to convergence. Maybe there will be one day, and you'll probably hear me say this a lot today. Each organization might find that its solution is one that looks a little different to another organization. But basically, it's a conceptual view of organizational risk and how these risks can be managed. So practically, what does this mean? A lot of people have suggested different ways to do it, and it's currently practiced in a lot of different ways. So one common approach to this is to bring together the physical security unit and the IT security unit within an organization. And it's been argued by people such as Chang, Kim and Park in 2014, that you can see here, that the inclusion of both physical security and information security forms a vital part of any comprehensive risk management system. So unfortunately, this still faces some resistance within organizations today, and we're going to look at that a bit more closely later. So we take these two entities, the physical security and IT security, and these two groups overlap today in ways that, can really only be ignored at the peril of an organization. For example, physical access controls now fall into both camps with network security cameras, magnetic swipe cards, and access card chips, etc. So if the people in charge of physical security aren't on the same page as what the IT people are doing, this is where problems start and risks start to go unnoticed, or even worse, they're noticed, but nobody knows who's responsible. So this is where converged management comes in. And whether you achieve this by making the two groups physically sit in the same offices as each other and become a single unit, or whether you achieve this at a management level approach where you try to build strong, reliable communication across the disparate units, it really depends on what the best fit is for your organization, and we'll touch on this a little bit later as well. But at the end of the day, the main goal of Convergence, whatever the approach is, it's the same, and that is to avoid organizational risk blind spots by collaborating with parts of the organization that are traditionally removed from the security group, whether it be IT or business continuity, health and safety, or legal and compliance. So we'll have a little look into the research I completed. As I said at the beginning, I became interested in this topic of convergence after seeing the struggle that some security practitioners were facing as they tried to implement a centralized converged approach to managing organizational risk. I also noticed in places where it was already being successfully used, how quickly it could just fall apart when the person who brought in the approach left the company. So I decided to specifically look at investigating the challenges to the effective implementation of converged risk and security management. Initially, I conducted a literature review on the available sources, and that ranged from academic writing, industry articles published, interviews, anything I could get my hands on that talked about the concept. And to complement this, I interviewed 8 senior level security industry professionals, and they hailed from across Europe, Australia, and the Middle East. I mean, the sample was admittedly small due to various constraints that I'm sure we are all familiar with this year and the end of last year. But we still felt that there was a broad range of experience within this sample group, so we could start to get an interesting look into addressing this problem. So why don't we start with some statistics just to see where convergence is at today. So at the beginning of this year, a gentleman called Michael Gibbs, who is a member of the ACES Foundation Research Committee, described the findings of the ACES report, the state of security convergence in the United States, Europe, and India, in the industry magazine Security Management. And I think there were some small glimmers of hope in this study, but overall, I think the findings were quite grim. So over 1,000 CSOs, CISOs, physical security directors, cybersecurity directors, business continuity heads, and crisis and disaster management leaders were asked about the state of convergence in their organizations and the barriers that they faced implementing it. So on the positive side, as you can see here, it appears that the smaller organizations that gross less than 25 million annually, they report quite high rates of convergence, at 31% being fully converged and 30% for a hybrid model of traditional security management with some form of convergence. Less positive, however, is you can see these figures drop quite consistently until you get to the largest organization, grossing between 1 and 10 billion annually, and they report a full convergence figure of 13%, and probably more damningly, it's 50% of them don't practice any form of this at all. So I find this quite disheartening because overall those surveyed, they agree that convergence, it provides greater benefits. They identified, and I will quote from the study, that the main reason to converge is sharing of information in a combined area, and that security is now so complex, physical and cyber, that combining all the knowledge is essential. So I'd also just like to take this moment to point out that I didn't really find anything specific on Australia regarding convergence figures during my research. Although there was a lot of mention of collaboration between government and private sectors, particularly in government papers, in things regarding particularly critical infrastructure and also natural disaster management, which I'm sure is probably fresh in a lot of your minds thanks to the catastrophic bushfires over last Christmas. And as Chris mentioned before, I did interview one Australian participant in my research, but after I finish talking to you, I'm really interested to hear what your local experiences are of this. So we'll have a look at some of my findings, and we'll look at the threat landscape today. So without a doubt, the threat landscape today, it still provides opportunity to practice convergence, and arguably it's calling for it. The nature of the threats and risks that organizations face today, they're more complex and challenging than they ever have been before. And it's not static. Operational complexities and the blended nature of the threats that they face are evolving all the time. You know, our world is so interconnected today with networked information security systems that are practically part of everyday daily life. You have supply chains cobwebbing around the world and back again. So this really means that one big event, it has the potential to cause damage that's so wide-reaching, it often feels like we're trying to catch up. So we should talk about some examples of this. And I guess right off the bat, we'll mention the big one that's been popping up in the corner of risk matrices for the last few years as disastrous, but hopefully unlikely, and that's COVID. The pandemic, and in particular the global scale of it, is challenging the security and continuity world in a myriad of ways. And I think it's in ways that can often feel quite unprecedented. So I think we should take this moment just to jump back in time a little bit to a place where we have the benefit of hindsight, and maybe we can identify why this thing called convergence is so critical today. And again, I guess the big obvious one would be September 11th, the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, the Pentagon, the failed attack on Washington, D.C. in 2001. And I know that it feels like a bit of a stereotype to bring up this event. It's nearly 20 years later, and I think we all know that there's a mountain of writing already on how it's affected our industries. But regardless of this, I think we can all agree that it was a real watershed moment for the security world, and it clearly demonstrated the holes and the failings of how we managed risks and threats. And it revealed security management issues that I think we're still trying to address today. So more than anything, this incident, it demonstrated the interconnected and complex operational environment today. And it showed how it can just be rendered utterly vulnerable if we don't manage and identify these interconnectivities. So for example, the effects of 9/11 extended far beyond the loss of obvious life and physical assets. There were organizations whose entire IT systems, they had to be rebuilt from scratch because off-site backups, they just didn't exist. You know, there were ongoing personnel problems, firstly when trying to recover from the loss of life, but then also with staff who were in grounded areas from the ongoing travel restrictions. I mean, continuity was really impeded. In fact, the government restrictions such as the grounding of all flights and border closures immediately following the disaster caused massive supply chain interruptions for the US. And where disaster recovery plans did exist, they were out of date, they were untested, if they existed at all. So suddenly, the board level in these organizations became really interested in security groups, and they hadn't really been that interested before. And in particular, they were interested in why they were paying for risk and threat management when clearly it hadn't been managed. And at the same time, and I'm sure feeling some pressure, some security practitioners began to realize that to be more effective, they had to be aware of and communicate with the entire organization, because just as operations had become more interconnected, so too had the fallout from disaster. The impacts and threats had now become blended and converged, and much like the operations, they maybe themselves needed a blended or converged response. So that they recognized they needed support not only from the top level, but from across the organization, because they could no longer exist in this vacuum. We like to call it silo, you know, practicing the dark art of security. They really needed contact and communication with other groups within, because without it, they couldn't get a clear idea of what was at stake when things went wrong. So in short, they really needed a single view of risk. So I think 9/11 highlighted problems that we're really still trying to deal with and solve today. For example, it's not uncommon to still hear the lament that security is yet to find its business voice and place in the boardroom, bringing together groups within organizations and facilitating the necessary collaboration that is required to get this single view of risk. This is still challenging nearly 20 years later. And I think this brings us back to where we are today with COVID. And COVID has provided, I believe, a watershed moment for business continuity practitioners, much like 9/11 did for security. The supply chain disruptions are on a massive global scale, and much like 9/11, it's showing us where the holes in our methods are, but I believe it might also be providing us opportunities to plug them. The struggle to provide and manage services remotely as staff are furloughed, global and local locations go in and out of quarantine, borders are closing and reopening and closing again with little predictability, particularly where I am at the moment in Europe. And this challenge is a big one, but it's also creating partnerships that didn't necessarily exist formally before. So for example, I know that our UK colleagues were happy to see themselves included in the list of essential workers issued by the UK government at the start of their lockdown earlier this year, where perhaps they'd felt undervalued or even ignored before. In some places, security personnel are now being called on to administer, for example, temperature checks for facility entrances. So what has stereotypically been considered a fairly low-skilled job now requires really specific training, and it has high stakes responsibilities. So more than ever, we really need to cultivate partnerships across our traditional boundaries as we try to manage this ongoing threat and its fallout. And I think this means that there's never been a better time to re-examine converged risk and security management and how we can start to make this happen. So despite the environment being ripe for this concept, it's still really slow to be widely used, as I touched on earlier. I mean, it's there, but it's still limited. And this isn't a new thing. It's been like this for over a decade now. And while there's very obviously a conceptual appreciation of the idea in the security world, it's really slow to make its way into a practical application. So how can we fix this for organizations that aren't finding it so simple? Because I believe that the need and the appetite is there. And between the literature I examined and the security professionals interviewed, it became clear that really there's a common set of barriers that keep popping up. And let's look at these a little more closely. So it seems like it's still hard to sell convergence within an organization. And there's a few reasons for this. Where often people are just unwilling to let go from all sides. One interviewee spoke of how a CSO might be reticent to attempt a converged approach because failure is going to affect their professional status. But even if they swallow this fear and they forge ahead, often they find it difficult to get buy-in from across the organization anyway. One interviewee put this quite succinctly, and I will quote, "I think it's very hard to get buy-in from all areas of the organization at the moment. It's very difficult. It's not a concept that's well understood. I tried to get the IT and cyber to work closely with the rest of security, but it was very difficult. Competing budgets is very difficult. Different people with different skill sets and being focused in their own silos is very hard to break down." So this comment touches on something that, it boils down to a lack of trust. For example, there's a lack of trust between IT groups and security groups, and this may not be a surprise to anyone here today. Quite often, both groups see the other as having specializations that are so far removed from their own that they don't recognize that often there's a need to sit down and collaborate. And a perceived loss of status really shouldn't be undersold here either. For example, why should an IT manager give up what they perceive as their responsibility to someone else with a totally different skill set? I mean, their stake in this is what gives them their job. So if the CSO can't speak the language of the business and sell the plan effectively, then also why shouldn't upper management doubt their abilities to manage the topic outside of what they see their specialization to be? And why shouldn't the IT manager be wary of opening their gates? But also conversely, the CSO must be able to trust those outside his unit that do have the relevant skill set to do what they're needed to do. So of the personal skills, and I can't highlight this enough, a strong business understanding and communication skills are absolutely critical. If you can't sell things within the organization, you're dead in the water. I mean, for example, to be able to communicate the return of investment that a strong risk management plan and method can provide is critical. And too often security is seen as a loss-making center, and it's our job to change that perception. So as I briefly mentioned before, there's still a disconnect between understanding convergence as a conceptual idea and then transferring it into a practical application. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's no single method or common framework for making convergence happen. And on one hand, this is totally fine because every organization is different. But this lack of common replicable organizational model can make it hard to sell and then implement initially, and particularly so if you've never done this before. So some security professionals interviewed expressed a preference for a complete merging of the relevant departments such as IT and security, while others preferred a more holistic and collaborative approach across departments. For example, facilitating regular meetings and cultivating strong relationships across the organization. But what was clear, though, was that neither method can succeed without strong leadership and clarity. And I will let one of the interviewees speak to this better than I can, and I will quote them. With all these different teams, what you end up having is different people, different responsibilities, where some of them know what they're responsible for, what's right for them to be responsible for, and yet there's other things that go where no one knows who's responsible. And because no one knows and this hasn't been clarified, that's where you end up with situations. So if we return again to the GIPS article, you can see that the methods of implementation are all over the place. You can see here that sometimes various units are combined, sometimes they're not, different combinations. So of course, every organization is different, and currently it makes sense, that no strategy would be the same. But are we doing ourselves a disservice by not trying to codify this somewhat? And I think that our friend Gibbs sums this up quite nicely when he says, nebulous plans or inchoate ideas for future integration of the three functions essentially summarizes the state of security convergence today. I mean, basically, we're all still a bit confused about it. So finally, let's come to our last identified barrier, and that's education and training. There is still a lack of relevant training to help facilitate convergence. So while we talk about security needing to break out of its silo, it's still really taught in a silo. We can't really expect people to practice security holistically when we don't teach it that way. I mean, currently you can do courses, in risk management over here, or business continuity over here, and physical security and access control there. We haven't really pulled it together yet. And we expect our practitioners to speak the language of business. But at the moment, unless they have this skill from their own experience, and quite often I know people seek out MBAs on their own, security management training currently isn't yet giving our practitioners all the tools they need. And finally, much like the business skills, we're saying that our practitioners have to have really strong soft skills. And traditionally, the security world isn't known for this, for communication and flexibility. So we aren't always giving the practitioners, what they need to develop and learn these. The stereotype of the secretive security group, I believe, is dying, but we still have a little way to go. So let's pull this all together and see what we have. So it's apparent I believe, when looking at the literature and the interview data, that overwhelmingly soft skills are necessary when you're trying to make convergence happen. Leadership and strong communication and negotiation skills and flexibility, they're all necessary to ensure organizational-wide buy-in and continuity of the plan. I mean, where it's lacking, it can lead to confused reporting lines and even personnel conflicts where those trust issues I spoke about aren't resolved. So what seems to be happening is, as I mentioned many times now, because there's no single model to do this, it's these soft skills that are being relied upon to sell convergence within the organization. And I think this is really relevant right now because thanks to COVID, a lot of our day-to-day activities aren't standard either. I mean, particularly where people are being forced to work remotely, where they haven't done this before. So now really is the time to be flexing those soft skill muscles. It's the time to be locking down those partnerships that COVID's making for us. For example, as I mentioned, the UK practitioners being classed as essential services. I think it's a hard thing to look to the future during a crisis. Obviously we're all trying to manage what's going on right now, but now really is the time to start building that single view of risk if we didn't have it before, because it doesn't look like things are going to get less complicated anytime soon. Just as an example, COVID's destabilized political and social structures that we've taken somewhat for granted, and there are pockets of civil unrest popping up all around the world. It won't get easier, and we need to be proactive. So this is more of an immediate approach, but I think in the long term, there really needs to be a stronger emphasis on the converged concept to security management training and also tertiary education. I mean, it is of note that as far back as 2006, ACES suggested that at a strategic management level, business and interpersonal abilities were more critical than technical security skills. So why aren't we focusing more on this? We can complain that security still hasn't found its place in the boardroom, but until we're sending people out there with the right skills, with the business knowledge, it's always ever only going to be a few people that can get in there and make things happen. If we're teaching in silos and we're not connecting the dots, for example, with security and continuity while we do it, we can't expect these silos to get broken down in the real world. So I also believe that in the long term, if we can move forward with these two elements, soft skills and education, we can increase implementation, and therefore we can increase industry experience and academic analysis. And eventually, perhaps we can start to move forward to a standard set of models, which will again, in turn, increase how we can implement this concept. So that's everything from me for the moment. Maybe we can open this up to any questions if there's any. And as I mentioned, I'm interested to hear about this in an Australian context as well. Thank you.